Preserving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Well, welcome to another program in Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and we are welcoming our listeners from all over North America. We ask that you support the Micro Effect Radio Network and that you help us get these satellite feeds up and running, because we can cover millions of listeners more if we have those satellite feeds up. And I thank our listeners for tuning in this morning. And this morning, I've got a returning guest from Debbie's show last week, Radioactive Wednesday, Mindy Patterson. And Mindy's been a guest on my show a number of times in the past, but Mindy was on Debbie's show, and she had to cut her interview a little bit short last week because she had other engagements. And so Mindy is back this week on my show to finish what she started. And I think the discussion here is going to be extremely important, because there's been some things that have happened in the last week that Mindy will make our listeners aware of. And I certainly appreciate everything that she brings into the discussion. So with that, Mindy, welcome to the show. And I want to lead in with a little bit of background on the Cavalry Group and on your background, so that you can tell our listeners how they can support what you're doing as well. And then let's get into the animal rights movement.
Great. Well, we are actually coming up on our 7th anniversary of the founding and beginning of the Cavalry Group. We launched because through my involvement in the horse community nationwide, and also in my state of Missouri, where HSUS descended upon us in 2010 with the ballot initiative, which was quite a hefty battle, we saw that there was a need to fill to help the little guy, to help animal-related businesses, small business, whether they're dog kennels or cattle ranchers, exotic animal exhibitors, deer farmers, all of which are, we have a vast array of animal-related businesses as members. We are a member-based company that provides access to legal defense to protect against illegal search and illegal seizure and false claims on behalf of our members. And we also advocate in the public relations and PR spectrum all across the nation on behalf of our members. And we also are battling in the trenches at the local, state, and federal levels against the egregious legislative attacks on animal-related businesses by the animal rights industries. And so that, in a nutshell, is what we do, and we are striving every day to, woven into our mission is to protect the constitutional and private property rights of all animal-related businesses. And as you and I have talked about many times, Dan, a lot of these attacks on animals and animal ownership is really the false facade and the toe in the door to chip away at our constitutional right to private property. So we take things from a very broad perspective and understand that animal agriculture and animal ownership has been the cornerstone of our nation since its founding. And it's no surprise that these egregious organizations or deceptive organizations are attempting to eliminate that from our lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly a good lead-in, and I would like to maybe have you explain to our listeners just exactly what the official definition of animal rights is, and then we can discuss why it's so important that we recognize the foundation of that as being something very different than our constitutional Republican form of government.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's very deceptive, but you bring up an important point, which is why we have made a point to inform our elected representatives at the local, state, and federal levels about the difference. Animal welfare endorses the responsible use of animals, whether it's for pets for companionship, animals in sport, education, entertainment, food, fiber, medical research. Animal welfare basically ensures the practice of animal husbandry and includes making certain that animals' basic needs are fulfilled, including, the obvious: food, shelter, veterinary care, exercise, etc. Whether you own a pet or make regular visits to your local zoo, chances are, everybody loves animals, but we need to be aware that there is a deceptive agenda, a movement, if you will, to remove animals from our daily lives that claim that they're about animal welfare, but they're really pushing an agenda, what we call animal rights. Animal rights is an ideology based on nothing more than emotion, not science or facts, and it advocates that animals are equal to humans. And by doing so, it eliminates and diminishes the sanctity of human life. But these animal rights extremists, I know oftentimes we call them activists, but they're really extremists and oftentimes terrorists. They use bully tactics, coercion, and basically to promote their deceptive campaigns to make sure that consumers reject all animal use, regardless of how great the care is. And I think that's really the most important point, is that your listeners understand that the animal rights extremists, their ultimate goal is for the elimination of animals from human care completely. It doesn't matter how great the care is. They say it is, and they keep coming up with ballot campaigns and legislation that claims to be about animal welfare, but it will never be good enough, ever, because they want animals eliminated, whether it's for food, fiber, fuel, entertainment, rodeos, etc. So some of the most high-profile animal rights organizations include very deceptively named organizations like the Humane Society of the United States, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. There's nothing ethical about PETA. The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the ASPCA. A lot of these groups have become almost just commonplace in our living rooms because they constantly run advertisements on the television. We've all seen them, and they are very, very deceptive. And the reason they're deceptive is because they take well-intended animal lovers who are willing to write a check for that $19.99 a month that you send off to these groups. They don't use it for animal care or shelters to benefit animals. They take that money, and their annual intake for many of these groups is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So they fund lobbyists to be in your state house, in your city councils, county councils, at the federal level also. They fund lobbyists, lawyers, and keyboard warriors, and even protesters. We've seen many times that HSUS and PETA fund protesters to go and use bully tactics to protest any animal-related exhibit or pet store or what have you. So this is something that we deal with on a daily basis, and it's again, I can't begin to emphasize enough that we have to be able to recognize the lies that they are putting forth, because all of it is emotional. That's how they're getting to the hearts and minds of Americans, and lining their pockets is to prey upon the emotions of the American consumer.
Well, and I know that part of the psychology of all of this is the fact that almost all Americans are pet owners, certainly a large percentage are, and we all love animals and we all care about animals and we care about the environment. And I don't want to indicate in any way that maybe some of the rank and file that work for these organizations are bad people, because I know a few of them, and they're pretty nice people. They're well-intended.
Yes.
I wouldn't say they're intellectually giants, but at the same time, they're well-intended people, and they take a lot of this stuff at face value, and they don't dig any deeper. And I think your point is that these organizations have turned into huge money-making schemes, and I know that a lot of these organizations, the lion's share of all the money they collect goes to salary for the top executives of these groups. Do you have any idea of what some of the payrolls are? I know that I think it's the ASPCA that the president or the head of that organization is making huge sums of money. Do you have any idea what some of these payrolls are?
I don't have the latest. I know that when Ed Sayers was head of the ASPCA, which was just a couple of years ago, he was his annual salary was around $500,000 annually. Wayne Pacelli, before he was forced to resign just a couple months ago, I believe his annual salary was reported in the $300,000 range. But even that's a deceptive shell game because I just I know that I've watched closely the spending of a lot of their ballot initiative campaigns, and I can't imagine that there's not some skimming going on and some money that's lining pockets on some of those events. But you're right, the salaries are exorbitant, and people need to understand what it is they're paying for. And again, these well-intended donors, I mean, I'm a huge animal lover, and I don't mean to convey in any way that we condone animal cruelty. That's not even the point here. The point is really the deceptive schemes that these groups are literally betraying Americans into donating money, and it's not used for what they say. I mean,
right.
That was one of the things that we did first thing in 2010 when we launched our own campaign to focus on the urban areas of Missouri, the urban voters. We took a poll statewide and found that most people, when they walked into the voting booth and read the summary of the Puppy Mill Cruelty Prevention Act, which was also well known as Proposition B that year, and who wouldn't vote for something that would provide, it said, basic needs, including food, shelter, water, veterinary care. Everyone would vote for that. The problem with the ballot initiative, as with every piece of legislation that is pushed by HSUS and other animal rights organizations, is that they bury they bury the lead. They bury the true intention of the legislation. And in Proposition B in 2010, that was the definition of pet. I mean, they claimed that this was about creating better standards of care, quote unquote, for dog kennels, but the definition of pet basically said any domesticated animal living near or around your home. So that could be cattle, that could be pigs, that could be chickens, food animals. So HSUS was making an attempt to get their toe in the door to set a precedent to attack animal agriculture in our huge ag state of Missouri. And again, it was very deceptive. But this polling that we took was interesting because anyone who's ever participated in a poll, you realize they ask you the question saying, would you vote for this measure today? And everyone across the board, the first question was, oh, I would absolutely vote yes on Proposition B. Well, the next question would be, well, would you still vote for Proposition B if you knew the group behind it spends less than half of 1% on animals, to benefit animals? And we would just chip away and go down the list, and the final question was, would you still vote for this proposition today now that you have all this information about the organization behind it? And about 80%, 85% roughly, people said they would not vote for Proposition B. And the very final question was, how does this make you feel now that you know this information? And we had a list of about 5 different things, and across the board, Missourians felt betrayed. That was the word, and that was the word that we went with because to push our campaign. And what we ended up doing was simply pulling back the veil so that voters could see the truth about the Humane Society of the United States, where their money really went, what their true intentions seemed to be, and the receipts were all there, how they spend their money. And people don't like to be lied to. Americans do not like to be lied to, and I think recent elections have certainly proven that. So that is the strategy, and I don't mind sharing that with the world because we all need to pull back the veil and the truth behind these animal rights groups that pressure, infiltrate, influence lawmakers, government agencies, and even inspectors to basically coerce and tell untruths to the public and change public sentiment about people who raise, breed, and work with animals. And it's a constant PR battle.
Absolutely. And Mindy, one of the things that comes out of all this is that you're right, Americans don't like to be lied to, but we certainly ought to be aware that literally that's all we've been for the last probably 40 years with the environmental movement, because animal rights and environmentalism and all these things are tied together. And you're absolutely right. They're all predicated on the understanding that we're going to change our form of government. As Obama said, we're going to have a transformation and total transformation. And that total transformation is to a system of government that's based on Marxism and certainly is not based on a republic concept of private property.
Well, that's very true, and you're right. The animal rights movement and the environmental movement go hand in glove, and it's a very, very deceptive movement. It's interesting because you just reminded me when you mentioned our form of government. The Humane Society of the United States, they claim to be all about, the welfare of animals. But the interesting thing about that, they were so infuriated that Missouri fought back against their ballot initiative. And although we still lost, we did make corrections to what was passed in our state legislature. And our legislators were very brave to take that on because the animal rights groups and extremists swooped into our state house and did not make it fun or easy to make those changes, which, by the way, were very unconstitutional in their measure. They wanted to limit dog breeders to a certain number of animals, and that is another dangerous precedent, because if you can do that to anybody raising, dogs, who's to say you can't limit that to a cattle rancher or a chicken farmer? Or, for that matter, somebody selling cars, or anything. These are important things for people to understand, the broader reach of some of these things. But unfortunately, too many voters and Americans get caught up in the emotion of the fact that it has to do with animals. But my other point was that HSUS came back with another ballot initiative in 2011, right on the heels of Proposition B, that was called Your Vote Counts. And really what it wanted to do, in the crux of things, it wanted to use the ballot initiative process to advance their agenda, and because basically it bypasses the legislature. And they wanted to make it so that anything that's passed as a ballot initiative could not be fixed in the legislature. So that is direct democracy. That is mob rule. And it is really important for Americans to understand that, too, because if HSUS is all about, animal welfare, what were they doing messing with our state constitution? This was an amendment that basically said that in order to change any ballot initiative, it had to have 2/3 of the vote in the House and the Senate. And as you and I both know, that's a pretty heavy lift. So for that to happen is slim to none. Therefore, anything that passed at the ballot box would just circumvent the State House and go directly into law. And I believe, and I'm saying this without having the actual year or act in front of me, but I'm pretty sure California passed something similar several years ago, which is why anything that passes at their ballot box bypasses their legislature and goes directly into law. And you get these unfunded mandates, and it makes your state completely bankrupt. So.
Well, and the other part of that, Mindy, is that it's one of the reasons they're trying to register all illegal aliens and virtually anybody that can get to the polls, including dead people, to vote. Because if you're controlling the legislative process with a direct a vote or a direct ballot, then it's important that you get all these mindless people to get out and vote.
Yes. Well, that's the thing about mob rule, is that, it increases the power and influence of the special interests, not necessarily those who are, in the trenches of the average American. And mob rule is one of those things that everybody thinks it all sounds great at the moment until it switches on them, And our founders were brilliant, because what they put into place with the checks and balances of our system of government and our republic took care of all that. It put mob rule at check, and that's why it prevents the tyranny and overreach that if everything is working as it's supposed to.
Absolutely, and you're right. They were brilliant people, and part of the reason that they created the system they did is because they were also scholars, classical scholars, and understood that democracy, as it had been tried a few times before, had been an abject failure, and that direct, vote, direct control through democracy was a very bad form of government. And they all wrote that in various letters in the Federalist papers and all these different writings by the founders. They made it very clear that they wanted a republic and not a democracy. Well, let's, you're talking about these organizations, and I have to tell you a personal story. We've got a little bit of time before the break, but when I was a county commissioner in southwest Montana, they had a meeting one morning in Helena, and it was for the stock growers, and there was a board that the stock growers had through a state agency. And at that meeting, they were having a meeting in the morning, and they were going to be talking about large predator control. Well, I got there a few minutes late because there was a blizzard, and I had to go over a couple of passes to get there. But anyway, I was maybe 4 or 5 minutes late to the meeting. And when I got there, there was a gentleman at one end of the table, and he was pretty much running the entire meeting. And he was talking about how important it was to pass this Senate bill that would, part of the agriculture bill that would provide money, taxpayer money, to pay for animal losses, and at the same time that it would promote non-lethal predator control. And he pretty much went through a whole list of reasons that this was really important and everything. And finally, at the end, I asked him, I said, well, why should the taxpayers pay for this? And why shouldn't the groups that initiated all these actions to bring wolves into the state of Montana, why shouldn't they be paying for it? And he said, we don't have the money. And I said, no, wait a minute. We don't have the money. I thought, who are you? And he said, my name's Bob Harrison, and I represent the Natural Resource Defense Council. And he had pretty much taken over the entire meeting from the beginning from the state people who were just kind of handing it over to him. And in any case, he said, we don't have the money. And I had downloaded at about 4 in the morning. I downloaded all the NRDC and all this other information on their financial statements and stuff. And I said, wait a minute, you just had a 2-year fundraising to get the wolves back on the endangered species list and get them relisted instead of delisted. And you raised $500 million. According to your own reports, you raised $532 million to do that. And I mean, what it all boils down to is that these groups go in the government because, so many of the bureaucrats, they just kind of roll over and let people like that take over a meeting. And next thing you know, we're doing things that we shouldn't be doing. Yes. And the long and the short of it is that Tester sponsored the bill, and they ended up getting it passed, and the taxpayers paid for livestock losses. But you've got to go through an awful lot of work to get those verified before you can collect a dime. And at the same time, the groups like NRDC are getting paid by the taxpayers to experiment with non-lethal, using flags and riders out there that are, obviously if you got riders out there, you got to have them out there with your herd all the time. Yep. And doing all these things, and the taxpayers end up paying for it. And that's the story of what has happened in our country. We've allowed the regulators to take control, and we need to understand, and this is something I want you to talk about on the other side of the break, but it's really important to understand that the regulators are controlled by these various groups, by these non-governmental organizations, and by these tax-exempt foundations.
Absolutely. Yes. That sounds
good. Well, we do have just moving into the break, so we'll see you on the other side of the break, and let's talk about just how important it is that the American people are aware of who is paying for what and how much influence these people have in our lives.
I'll be here.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic. Wake up, it's time to understand.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today our guest is Mindy Patterson. And Mindy, we were talking about the animal rights groups, and I want to have you get into just exactly how these groups are infiltrating our government agencies. But before I do, I want to remind our listeners, please support this radio network. With your financial help, we can get the satellite links that we need to get our word out to millions and millions and millions of people, and we cannot do that without your help. The other thing I want to do is I want to remind our listeners that Debbie Bacigalupi's Radioactive Wednesday is on Wednesday morning starting at 9 a.m. Mountain Time. And Debbie has wonderful guests on her program, and she will be helping to connect the dots as well. So with that, Mindy, I'd like to get back to the discussion and tell us who these people are that are infiltrating our government agencies.
Well, to take a step back, we are so blessed to have dodged a huge bullet to have Hillary Clinton in the White House. I mean, we really are just so lucky to have President Trump working so hard to unravel the many anti-American, unconstitutional actions that were taken during the Obama administration. And even before Obama was in office, there, under the umbrella of Agenda 21, what is now called Sustainable Development, and other things, there was something called the President's Council on Sustainable Development, which was not something that was broadly discussed, but it existed, which, by the way, is now, that was one of the first things I looked at after Trump took office, by the way. It is no longer on the White House website, which is great. But when Obama was sworn into office in January of 2009, after being elected in 2008, one of the first things that we noted was the aggressive shift that took place at USDA, among other agencies, by the way. I mean, it wasn't just USDA, it was all the government bureaucracies. But we noticed the change because many of our members are licensed by USDA. And so we saw this very aggressive, the targeting of, through the inspection process that took place. And we also noticed, we started looking to some of the people that were new faces at USDA in charge of the regulatory enforcement in a division of USDA called APHIS, which is the acronym for the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. And within APHIS, there is a small division called Animal Care. And Animal Care basically oversees USDA licensees, such as breeders, such as exhibitors, those who show up at the state fair, those who own animal exhibits that you see at the circus, zoos. They're all USDA licensed. well, there was this person by the name of Sarah Conant, C-O-N-A-N-T, and she's still there. We talk about the swamp and how a lot of these people are still in place, whether we want to call it the swamp or shadow government or whatever we want to call it. Many of these people are still there. And Sarah Conant was in charge of enforcement at APHIS. And the interesting thing about her is that she was a former litigator at the Humane Society of the United States. So someone who has this animal rights ideology and bringing that to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and overseeing the enforcement and inspections of animal-related businesses, I mean, you just can't make it up. And, you know, in 2009, I remember the onslaught. People were literally dropping their licenses like flies. I mean, people just didn't want to have anything to do with the USDA, which is really a shame, but that's their goal. They want to basically eliminate these, you know, legitimate, legal, licensed businesses. But it was under this you know, this premise of you would go to address people at USDA and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. What's the problem? You know, everyone acts like, you know, there's nothing to see here. There's no problem. But we all knew that the fox was in the hen house. And we certainly saw this with other agencies, from OSHA to the EPA, the aggressive onslaught of this enforcement actions on licensees. So basically, after 8 very long years of that, we have really looked for some relief with Trump in office, and we have seen some, but it is still a concern because a lot of these individuals who came on board during the Obama administration are still there. So the swamp, the shadow government, whatever you want to call it, still exists. And our organization is working, you know, closely with new leadership at USDA. But the problem is that the culture has changed so drastically within that agency that, you know, you can't just turn the Titanic on a dime. You know, it's going to take a little bit of time. And with a lot of these new appointees, you know, the new undersecretary over APHIS was just sworn into office in early November of 2017 because, as you and I talked about, Dan, the slow walking of all these new appointees by President Trump, you know, were taking a while to take place. And to come in from their positions out there in other jobs and to get up to speed quickly, it's a heavy lift. So I don't believe that they know all that needs to really take place. We've certainly been working with them to point some of these things out, but the list is long. And, you know, we've had a front row seat, quite frankly, to the nightmare that USDA has been implementing on American citizens who happen to raise, breed, and exhibit animals and have to be licensed by USDA. But yes, they're infiltrating, and we also know for a fact that it's not just at the federal level. We have witnessed this kind of infiltration at the state and local level as well. We're still, and again, you know, I can't help but believe that this is all overspill, if you will, from this President's Council on Sustainable Development, which, if anybody understands how that works, it basically is a directive from the White House during the time of the Obama administration to these federal agencies, and then the federal agencies give directives to governors, mayors, city councils, county councils, even school boards and planning and zoning. So just like with USDA and Sarah Conant and some other people still hanging around, you know darn well they're still hanging around at the city and at the local level and the state level as well. So we're seeing this onslaught and this ideology living on at the local level to basically pick winners and losers. Essentially, they are. Well, just recently we've had an issue in Washington State where a pet store has had this out of the blue. They're the only pet store in a particular county in Washington, and the local animal control officer told them that he was working on promulgating a rule to require them to reveal the name and all of the fine details of where the breeders are from, where they live, all the fine details. Well, if you purchase a puppy from this pet store, you get all that information. But they want everything to be on a placard on the cover of every single kennel. Well, if you just walk into a pet store, I don't think anybody should necessarily have the information and the location of where the breeders live. There have been some tragic situations that have happened because of this alleged, quote-unquote, transparency that the government is now requiring of people who breed animals for sale. And transparency oftentimes now is code for invasion of privacy. And they, unfortunately, the people with nefarious intentions, such as the animal rights groups, there have been 2 murders in recent years, unsolved, by the way, against dog breeders who unfortunately allowed pet buyers to come onto their private property to sell a puppy. And these people posing as puppy buyers actually, had other intentions and brought harm and, quite frankly, murdered these people. So to put private information out there just willy-nilly is something we need to be on top of in our country, and I don't think that it should be promulgated as a rule by an animal control officer where it does not state anything in the local statute that this kind of lawmaking or rulemaking is allowed. And it turns out this animal control officer is a former, he's on the board of a very radical group in Chicago, and he relocated in recent months to this county in Washington. So, part of our job is to trace who these people are and figure out what's going on. And unfortunately, oftentimes we unravel the truth, which is pretty ugly. And this is how these people are working, whether, this sounds like the work of groups like Earth Liberation Front or Animal Liberation Front. I mean, these underground groups, this is how they work. They infiltrate into these government agencies to squeeze people out of business. Now, why would they be doing this to one pet store in King County? Well, this is what's happening all across the U.S., is that HSUS is basically banning the retail sale of purebred dogs in pet stores. So that's part of their agenda.
Well, and Mindy, you've said something that's incredibly important that our listeners really need to understand. This is no longer an agenda, it's a culture within all our various government agencies. And that culture, it's taken a long time to create it. It is let's say it's a process that's happened across the political spectrum. We need to recognize that progressives of both parties have been hard at work undermining our very basic systems of government for a very long time. I don't want to put a time limit on it because the fact is it's been happening for well over 100 years.
Yes.
But one thing that our listeners need to understand is how deeply embedded this culture is. And certainly you mentioned things like county governments, local governments, school boards, and certainly the planners are right in the thick of this stuff, and it is so deeply embedded. It's going to take a long time to clean this mess up. And one of the things that I want to stress certainly to our listeners now, but we need to really work on this, is the fact that our side is so poorly funded and underfunded, and the other side is so heavily funded, and it takes money to get some of these things done. And we need to get people to step up and do the right thing and start supporting our efforts, because if they don't, we are going to see something happen to this country that's going to affect everyone, and that is the end of our constitutional republic.
Yes, I could not agree more. I see oftentimes, I think many people from our side feel overwhelmed, and I think that your comment is very important, because there are organizations out there for people, if they can't make an effort, then donate to support others' efforts, and I think that's really important. I think too, one of the as I said earlier, the Cavalry Group has had a front row seat to this nightmare of this onslaught of overreach by USDA, and while we work to defend our members against these government agencies, but what they do is they implement rules that are inconsistent with the law. And you get these inspectors that play the judge, jury, and the executioner, but they've been told by leadership at their agency to do this. And again, it all goes back to this President's Council on Sustainable Development. And they're basically given the handbook of telling people to abuse the rules and regulations, to over-criminalize its licensees, and using bully tactics if they have to, sometimes force, to coerce law-abiding, hard-working families out of business. And with President Trump in office, I'm very hopeful that these agencies will become more of a partner and no longer an adversary to its licensees, but it is taking a while. But, those agencies are no longer allowed to circumvent Congress to implement these new rules, with President Trump and his mandate saying that with every new rule we have to eliminate two. And that was absolute music to our ears, because the onslaught, how many, I believe there were like 4,000 new laws that Obama implemented in his last year of office, or new regulations rather. It was just ridiculous. And
it's crazy.
And the global progressives, they came very close to succeeding with a Hillary Clinton presidency. And as you and I were talking yesterday, you hit the nail on the head, as always, when you said they don't like to lose. And so what we're seeing now is this frenzy, this uprising from the other side to basically fight against the Constitution. And now is the time for everybody to engage like never before, demanding that those who we put in office have to fulfill their promises to, for lack of better description, unshackle the American people and engage in making our voices heard above the fray of what we're seeing, I would describe as anarchy, quite frankly, above these crazy radicals and a lot of the misled youth. The youth that's out there are just completely, I guess misled is sort of a nice way to put it. But
they've been indoctrinated through a school system that's been progressive in nature for over 100 years. I mean, even as a kid, I can recognize now that things were some form of indoctrination, and I'm 67 years old, so obviously it's been going on for a very long time. And I think we need to realize just how insidious this whole process has been. And we were laughing about it yesterday, but, right now with the NCAA March Madness basketball going on, folks, there's also a March Madness going on in this country. And it has nothing to do with basketball. It has everything to do with all these radical groups that are just going nuts, trying to take back the position that they see slipping away. Okay, Mindy, I'd love to talk about this, the culture again, and get back to that aspect of it. How have you seen the culture change really over the last 20 years? And certainly, I've seen it over a much longer time because I've been around a little bit longer. But the culture has changed in a way that emotion is 90% of what drives legislation. It's all predicated on UN Agenda 21 now, sustainable development, and
Yes.
it's been happening in both parties. And now we see both political parties, and now we see just how deeply it's embedded in our education system. And I've had Holly Swanson on to talk about that in the past, but tell our listeners how the radical animal rights movement has used our youth to really promote their agenda.
Well, what we've witnessed in the past several decades is nothing short of a radical transformation in the philosophy that informs the regulation and treatment of those who who own and raise animals for profit. You know, animal agriculture, the pet industry, etc., and specifically these time-tested agriculture practices to ensure that already ensure the health and safety of both people and animals are being redefined as inhumane treatment of animal livestock by those who have an emotion-based agenda. We're letting them, as you and I have talked about before, they are controlling the definitions. You know, they've completely ruined the word sustainable. It now means completely something different when historically and, you know, just by pure definition, farmers and ranchers have always been sustainable if that means conserving a balance of, you know, for resources. But this emotion-based agenda is what has made the shift and has emboldened government agencies and inspectors to increasingly make the use of these fines and seizures of animals that are based more on an effort to appeal to the public sentiment than they are to the letter of the law or to any standard of best practices for animal agriculture producers. So I believe that the origin of shift can be traced directly back to the animal rights movement as a line of thinking that basically gradually gained a foothold in universities and in government over the last 40 years. So what was once a radical ragtag group of extremists that, you know, were, you know, back then, 40 years ago, they were the ones that were, you know, throwing blood on fur coats in Aspen, and, you know, they were looking, like I say, ragtag. They're now these multi-million-dollar coalition of organizations that raise money under the guise of running pet shelters, and ultimately they spend their money on the promotion of increased regulation on animal ownership and animal enterprise. So these organizations are, you know, they're humane in name only, as I said before, but there's a web of these organizations. I mean, all roads lead back to the Humane Society of the United States and the ASPCA and PETA, but there are all these different groups that are splinter groups of these main groups, and some of them just have such benign-sounding names, but they raise their money while appearing to be, you know, these
something that they're not.
Something that they're not. So while their appearance is considerably different than it once was, their end goal is still the same. And if these organizations had their way, all pets would be adopted from shelters, and all consumption of meat would be prohibitively expensive for most Americans, for the, you know, only the wealthy elite. So these organizations pursue their radical agenda first through direct lobbying of government entities, and then through ballot initiatives and legislation. And as we just said, they've been infiltrating.
They have.
And that's how they're getting their agenda done.
We're going to have to pick that thought up on the other side of the break, but
sure.
Please keep that in mind.
Living the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today our guest is Mindy Patterson. And before we get back into the discussion, I want to remind our listeners to tune in tomorrow morning to Debbie Bacigalupi's Radioactive Wednesday. Debbie has terrific guests on her show, and she is really a terrific young lady who is, I think, going to be one of the great radio personalities in the future, in the coming decades. And we need to support her efforts, and we need to support the efforts of this radio network, the Micro Effect Radio Network. We need to get folks to pony up and start supporting the actions to get these satellite feeds in, because we can go from many thousands of listeners to many millions of listeners if we just get these satellite links up and running. And it's going to require effort and money on the part of our listeners, because we can't do it all out of our own pockets. We spend a great deal of our time putting these radio programs and these efforts together, and we're not getting paid to do this. We are doing this because we love this country. It's time that we get our listeners to pony up and start putting some money into the effort to save this nation, because if they don't, we're going to get what we deserve. And quite frankly, I don't want to be part of that if that's the case, and the other side wins. And Mindy, when we were talking, you were mentioning the fact that so many of the radicals from the 60s have become part of the radical animal rights and also the environmental movement. That's no accident, because communism, when the SDS and these various very well-recognized communist groups were part of the protests of the 60s and the 70s, when the communist threat died down, or supposedly died down, they moved into the animal rights and into the environmental movement. And many of the key people of these organizations come directly from that Marxist movement. Am I right?
100%. Look no further than Cass Sunstein, who served as Obama's regulatory czar. I mean, he is an attorney who graduated from Harvard, and he held this position as the administrator of the White House office and information and regulatory affairs for Obama. He is a well-known animal rights extremist, a vegan. And it even says on his bio that he's devoted to establishing legal rights for livestock, wildlife, and pets. He is also opposed to our Second Amendment. This man is now, after he left in September of 2013, I believe, or 2015, he left working for the Obama administration to go back to teaching law at Harvard Law School. So, we touch on some of these people, and if they're not working in government, they're teaching and indoctrinating our kids in colleges and universities. And, the list goes on. I mean, Bill Ayers, Cass Sunstein, a lot of these people find themselves in government and creating policy with this ideology and to fundamentally transform our republic by, eliminating our Constitution, chipping away at our Constitution, but also inserting this ideology that animals are equal to people. So.
Well, and I think people need to understand that they are, for the most part, they want to see the American people in the kennels. My good friend Dr. Michael Kaufman, who died this last summer, but he used the term human kennels. They plan to put us in stack and pack housing in these mega cities, and they literally, which will be surrounded by walls and gates, and nature will be on the outside, and we will be in these mega cities, and we will be in human kennels if they get their way.
Yes, and it's really, I spend a lot of time researching and reading books by the enemy, because it is a roadmap as to where they want to go. And it's important to understand, I believe, who the enemy really is. And another individual I think is important to mention, his name is Peter Singer, and he really is the founder of the animal rights movement. He wrote a book many years ago called Animal Liberation, the definitive classic of the animal movement. And his ideology is really scary. And if I recall correctly, I seem to remember Obama including him on his policy board, or, having input on his Obamacare policy when he was discussing who would be, the age cutoff for the availability of health care. I don't think many Americans realize that, Peter Singer had a hand in Obamacare. He says himself, and even in this book, Animal Liberation, that a child really isn't a viable human until they're at least 5 years of age. And in the Obamacare policy, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the cutoff for health care, his ideology was that you'd lived a full life by the time you were 55, and that you would not be, you should not have health care available to you after a certain age for life-saving health care or surgeries or treatments.
Right. I think 75 was pretty much the date of termination, and this kind of radical thinking really is based on Darwinian in its paganistic thinking that humans are no more special than any other animal, and it's anti-Christian, anti-biblical, and it's a way of thinking that is totally the opposite of what we really should be thinking in this country. Mindy, we have a caller on, and I don't normally take too many calls because I like to keep our dialogue going, but we have a caller from Brunswick, so obviously our word is getting out to a wide range of listeners, and they have a question that they would like to direct to you. Let's take that question.
Hello. Good morning.
Yes, hi.
My name is Werner. I'm calling you from New Brunswick in eastern Canada, and I've been thrown into the troubled waters now for over 42 years. And I've been studying the so-called animal rights movement, and it is nothing else what I've seen here. The leadership is determined by the communist agenda.
Okay,
In the mid-70s, a whole clique came in, and by hook and by crook, they drove the sustainable farmers, they drove them out. And if they didn't go willingly, they had to be put out on a stretcher.
Wow.
What I've been documenting...
Dan, I could not understand the audio at all, so you'll have to let me know what the question is.
I'll relay the comments and the questions. Would you tell us now what country was this sustainable farming being part of?
Basically, it was all over, or most over North America. But I'm calling from the East Coast, here from Eastern Canada, and there is a similar situation in the New England states, where the sustainable farmers were driven out with the help of those animal rights groups, by government agencies from the Department of Agriculture to the Department of the Environment in order to make room for the big taxpayer-supported industrialized agriculture and in favor of the big chemical companies, where the government has been pushing chemical farming. We know who are the benefactors are, like Monsanto and Merck and Bayer and all those companies.
Right.
But it's very much to the detriment of the population. And the farmers that did not go out willingly, they had to terminate by taking them out on a stretcher. And here it comes in about some of those groups that are advocating the withdrawal of life support at the age of 55 or 75.
Right.
This is basically the old communist agenda.
It is. There's no question. Well, thank you for your comments, and I will relay those on to Mindy. Mindy, the gentleman called from Brunswick in eastern Canada, and he has been following this very closely for the last 40 years, and he mentioned the sustainability agenda and how in Canada and certainly in parts of New England he's aware of, they are really promoting this sustainable agenda, and it's really targeted against small farmers, against real sustainable agriculture, and it's geared to promote the big chemical companies, the big agribusinesses like ADM and the big corporate entities that are part of agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And he would like to hear your comments on just exactly how you see this, the big agriculture and the communist agenda being tied together.
Well, a lot of this sustainable development and sustainable agriculture has been going on in other countries before it really came on shore here in the U.S., Australia and the European Union. And interestingly enough, which I don't think very many Americans realize, a lot of these so-called, welfare policies have been imposed on food producers in the European Union quite a while ago. Things that HSUS is pushing through ballot initiatives in our country now has already gone through in the European Union, and it really, all of these things hurt the little guy, as you said. As far as the attack by a lot of these policies, it seems the big ag always seems to survive, and it's really what it's doing is creating a monopoly. But in the European Union, a lot of these policies were already imposed on those egg producers, phasing out conventional cages for egg-laying hens, and a transition system called, which is used here in the U.S., enriched colony cages in the United States. And in the, I said the EU, I meant the UK. They basically have had an egg shortage at crisis level at different points in the last several years, diminishing the egg supply because a lot of egg producers just got out of business. And that's the ultimate goal of this whole sustainable agriculture and with the animal rights movement really at the forefront as the window dressing, if you will, for this movement. But it is basically to eliminate those who produce our food, because ultimately they want to take things back to Earth's original state, and because they believe in the false claims of climate change, and that these agriculture businesses are, even if it's the family farmer, are bringing harm to our environment. So this results in fewer egg farmers, which means fewer eggs, and fewer eggs means higher prices for the consumer, and importing more of our food from other countries where neither animal welfare nor food safety is top priority. And that's really what I don't think Americans are focusing on, the long-term effects of a lot of these policies. We have an exceptional food system here in the United States, and when I talk about conventional farming practices, I'm not talking about big ag, because in conventional farming, 98% of our family farmers make up conventional agriculture. So while these regulations may sound reasonable on the surface, the agenda behind them lies within these organizations pushing these cleverly crafted laws cloaked in a disguise of emotional propaganda that are used to advance these proposed regulations into law. And we've already seen this happen in the UK that has resulted in an egg crisis. I think at one point in the UK they were paying as much as $12 for a dozen eggs. And eggs have traditionally been the most affordable protein available for families, and that's just outrageous. But that's where we're headed here in the U.S. if we're not careful. And
and that's a big part of the whole communist system, is that it always promises utopia, but it always ends up with huge shortages, because anytime you take free enterprise out of the equation and you start doing controlled economies, it never works. It never works the way it's supposedly designed to do. And, the bottom line is that if Americans want more expensive food, all they have to do is continue to follow this line of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Mindy,
and again, most people who aren't paying attention think that some of these things sound reasonable on the surface, but it's what's behind it and who's behind it that's very important to note. And he brings up a good point.
Well, what it boils down to is that people need to realize that food doesn't just grow itself. And animal protein is a huge part of the American diet, the world diet. If we want healthy people, I can tell you that this vegan diet thing, this is a pipe dream of a handful of people that feel a particular way, and it doesn't have anything to do with science and reality. And
right.
In science and reality, the reason that we've got such good food production in this country is because we've had the rights of individual farmers for all these years, and they are being forced out. And what will replace it will be something that's totally different, than the kind of low-cost, high-quality food system that we've got right now.
Amen. And just so your listeners understand, a lot of the regulatory reform that's happening, laced with emotion to get it passed, whether by legislation or ballot initiative, the goal of these animal rights and environmentalists is they're working to eliminate animal confinement. And they're looking to eliminate breeding of animals. Some of the leaders of the animal rights movement have, all you need to do is read their quotes out of their own words. For example, John Goodwin, who's the grassroots coordinator for the Humane Society of the United States, he says himself that his goal is the abolition of all animal agriculture. So when he says that, and you look at their policies, they want to eliminate animal confinement, animal breeding, private ownership of a lot of these captive breeding operations, and they also vilify making a profit, which is also another pillar of Agenda 21, because they're looking to destroy capitalism. And so they're influencing all of these things through the ruse of climate change. So, we've got the environmental, the economic, and the social justice pillars that are out to destroy private property, the destruction of, as you said, free market capitalism, which is really the solution to all these things. If we have people who shouldn't be in business, we need to release the chokehold from our free market, and so thereby the destruction of animal agriculture. And that's their formula. And their formula basically is to raise the cost, whether it's of meat, milk, eggs, pets, and livestock, reduce the total production of these foods or pets and livestock by, increasing the regulation, and all these things combined incrementally weakens the economic structure of any animal agribusiness. And that's really at the root of all of it. And as you said too, Dan, which this is the soul, this is the foundation of everything right here, is that we have to protect the rights of the individual. All of these policies, all of these things are working to push for the collective. And anyone who has studied the roots of Agenda 21 understands that they want the individual rights to take a back seat to the collective. And all of that goes to all this local control. All of these infiltrators at the local level are pushing for the collective. And it's all of these things are subtle. And we're, thwarted into playing defense to fight back against land use control and urban growth boundaries and smart growth and sustainable development and sustainable farming and conservation easements and green building and open space and all these things. All of it is code for collective control, and and that's what is at the root of this sustainable farming or sustainable development. And people need to understand that we can't grow and raise our food, and if we don't have, continue to support the foundation of private property.
Absolutely, yeah. You're right on the money, and the thing that people need to understand is that the control of our political process has been going on through UN Agenda 21 in a way that couldn't happen when it was communism versus capitalism in the old days of the Cold War.
Yeah.
The Cold War, in my mind, communism never died. Not only did it not die, but it's much stronger today than it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Because if you look at the world now and in the nations of the world, much of Africa and much of South America now is under either very high socialist government or communism or under some sort of totalitarian system. And those countries weren't that way 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been losing the Cold War, whether we realize it or not. We lost the Cold War, let's put it that way. And communism just slipped under the covers, and now it's back in the form of the Green Movement. And I'm going to use an example here, Mindy, and I know you're very familiar with this, but Mikhail Gorbachev, he was and is a hardcore confirmed communist. And he made no bones about the fact that he believed in communism as the only form of government. When he went out of power in the Soviet Union, he immediately went to the Presidio, which is a military base in San Francisco, and was given many, many millions of dollars by the Ford, Rockefeller, and a number of other foundations to fund the Gorbachev Foundation, which is the parent of Green Cross. Green Cross is the most respected environmental organization in the world. It's the one that all the others have spun off of. It's no coincidence that happened the same year that UN Agenda 21 was brought to America.
Yep.
That's
a very important point.
A quote here, and we're going to be going into the break shortly, but let me do a quote, and this is Mikhail Gorbachev, a speech before the Soviet Politburo on November 2nd, 1987. Quote, "In October 1917, we parted with the old world, rejecting it once and for all. We're moving to a new world, the world of communism. We shall never turn off that road. Comrades, do not be concerned about all you hear about glasnost and perestroika and democracy in the coming years. These are primarily for outward consumption. There will be no significant internal change within the Soviet Union other than for cosmetic purposes. Our purpose is to disarm the Americans and let them fall asleep." Well, obviously, that unquote, that they managed to do that, didn't they?
They sure did. Wow.
Yeah. And I've got another quote here that I'm going to do real quickly before we move into break. And that is Mikhail Gorbachev on a report called War on Mankind, the Violence Project. Quote, "The threat of environmental crisis will be the international disaster key that will unlock the New World Order," unquote. Okay, we'll move into break, and we'll bring this discussion up on the other side of the break.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today we have Mindy Patterson on as our guest. And Mindy, we were talking about how communism has really taken a new, let's say, a new direction, and that direction is through radical environmentalism and radical animal rights. You and I were talking yesterday privately about the infiltration of not just the government agencies, but also in producer associations. And you mentioned the Cattle Women's Group up in Montana. Would you like to tell our listeners your experience, what happened when you were trying to work with that group?
Well, actually, it was a group of American agri-women most recently in this past weekend, and it's a bipartisan, political group, but we basically set policy at our mid-year meeting every year before we do our what we call a fly-in to Washington, D.C., to meet with our congressional representatives and senators at the federal level to discuss all matters related to agriculture. And to be a member of this group, you have to be a producer of some sort. There are people there who, I represent the horse community and horse owners, but there are dairy farmers, cattle ranchers, so everybody's a producer of some sort, soy farmers and so forth. But it was very clear when setting our policy stance. Basically, we go through the previous year's policy decisions and make sure that everything's in place and rewriting them for the upcoming fly-in. And there was a handful of new faces in the room that seemed to be wanting to shift policy verbiage, if you will, to include things like social justice. Things that were not rooted in constitutional principles, and it was very worrisome. But I saw it firsthand, and it all comes across very subtle, and it was really interesting because there were some who didn't want to rock the boat. There were others who were unafraid and took a stand against this nonsense. But we're seeing this, and because we do what we do, we represent animal owners and animal-related businesses all across the country. Here I was a part of this meeting, but I've already seen this happen with other associations. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums, recently, here's a perfect example of how this happens. This sort of overtaking of the ideology of a group's association that's supposed to be representing its members. It's really dangerous because once the leadership changes, it's over. And people want to jump ship and start a new group, and that's what a lot of people are doing. But at AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, a guy by the name of Dan Ash, who's the former director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who was appointed at the federal level by President Obama, left his post last year to be the new executive director of the AZA. And one of the first things he did in his new post was to invite Wayne Pacelli, who at the time was the president and CEO of the Humane Society of the United States, to come and be their keynote speaker at their convention in September. I mean, it's just insane. And then we have the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council, who in 2015, they invited Ed Sayers, who was the former CEO of the ASPCA, to be the new executive director of their group, also known as PJAC. And the reason Ed Sayers is dangerous is because he created the Animal Rights Political Action Committee that in New York City to raise money to elect Mayor de Blasio with the promise of shutting down the horse carriages. So, those are just a handful of examples of things that are happening. These associations, and then we have the National Cattlemen's Beef Association that wants to basically implement what's called their Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And guess who they're partnering with to implement this? The World Wildlife Fund, or Federation.
Oh, dear. Really?
Yes. They're partnering with this group because they think that they need to show the world that they're sustainable. And they're going to be using, it's talk about a forced transformation and talk about unconstitutional. They're wanting to use the checkoff dollar of their producers to implement this plan. And, as one of my friends who produces beef out of Oklahoma, she said herself so beautifully, she said, this is like handing us a shovel to dig our own grave. And it all goes back to the rights of the individual and the free market. as you said, Dan, we've been operating quite well without these associations and without all these groups for many years, and we have to get away from this idea that we have to be a part of a collective. You know, it's just it's insane what's going on, and what also is very troubling is that so many producers act like they have to collaborate with the enemy to fend them off and invite them to the table. We need to stop this. I really am, and it all goes back to why our founders believed that the most important of our constitutional rights boiled down to ownership of private property, because they knew that if we lose private property, the country would collapse. So, you know, we believe so strongly that, you know, never compromise on issues of private property, never collaborate with those who seek your demise, and always question anyone who's against our constitutional principles. You know, we're really having our mettle tested in the United States. These are very troubling times, especially when a lot of the truth is being suppressed from the American people. And the truth that keeps us free in America is what we really need to cling to. And we're sure as heck not going to get it from the mainstream media, which is why we appreciate you and your show so much, because people are going to hear the truth. They're going to hear exactly what's happening to people out there across the country. And, you know, you are yourself rooted in and have been forever. I mean, this is how you ground your entire show and your life. It's all rooted in the Constitution and our protecting our God-given rights that are, you know, protected by the Constitution. And that's what we're like I said, we're having our mettle tested on all these issues. But it's the truth is being suppressed from the American people, and unfortunately, too, I have to include our children in that, because they're being indoctrinated still in our schools to believe that global environmentalism is the way to live so that they will become global citizens. One of the main premises of the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, which was established, uses several chapters from Agenda 21 as their national curriculum. I don't know if that's still happening under the Trump administration, but again, all of this is about creating a transfer of loyalty from our family to the government. And it's happening not just with kids, but adults too. I see it every day. It's, you know, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Yeah, well, and it's not just a transfer of the responsibility for the kids from the family to the government. It's also a transfer of our national government to an international collectivist system. And it's all predicated on a world government, and that our system is not going to be successful. We need to move into a world government under a system of communism or socialism or any number of isms, but everything except individualism.
Exactly. And I'm grateful because President Trump is anti-globalism, and he seems to be holding his stance on that.
He is, and I you know, one of the things that you were mentioning is through these various associations, and I'd like to get back on that discussion.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because
yes.
I think it's really important. No.
I went down the wormhole.
Well, you know, the thing that we've got to do is we've got to realize that these various associations, they're well established. Mm-hmm. They've been doing good work for decades. They are now being infiltrated by our enemies, and we are allowing that to happen. And as you say, many of the people that were the strength of these old associations, what they do is they say, well, we'll just go out and form a new association, and we'll get away from that. But the fact is those old associations have a great reputation. they have a legacy behind them, and when you abandon those and try to move into a new organization, it's going to take decades to build the kind of credibility for those new organizations that the old ones have already. And don't abandon those organizations. Stand up and do the right thing and tell people absolutely no. We are not going to transform our organization into your collectivist New World Order system.
It's uncomfortable. I witnessed it with my own two eyes and ears over this past weekend. You know, I saw the old guard stand firm and won out. I mean, so things were not changed, were not transferred. You know, we remain strong, but it was very uncomfortable. And, you know, under the heading of, you know, people don't want to rock the boat or cause, you know, inharmony or all these things, you know, we really need to stand firm on standing up for the Constitution. It needs defending. And the government sure isn't going to do that. It's up to us to defend the Constitution. And it's in situations like that, which may seem to some people to be a small thing because we're just having this small meeting, you know, with this relatively small group, but it makes a huge difference. And we all need to stand firm in defending the Constitution. And that's part of, you know, defending the Constitution through our actions and our deeds, to continue to demonstrate to our fellow American what makes our nation unique and so wonderful as we continue to support and defend the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you know, your comment about how important it is to support these groups, at the same time, we need our listeners to understand how important it is to be involved, period. You know, our system of government is John Adams said, our system of government was never designed to be filled by people that are disinterested and treated like a untended garden. Our garden needs to be weeded. Our garden needs to be protected and preserved, and the only way you can do that is if you get out and roll up your sleeves and be part of the solution rather than just being part of the lazy class that sits on their butt and allows everybody else to do the heavy lifting.
I love that. Well, you know, you'd think that supporting the U.S. Constitution would be a bipartisan desire, especially considering the fact that every elected official at the local, state, and federal levels take an oath of office to uphold and protect the Constitution of the United States. And as I've said before, it is, after all, what makes America America, a constitutional republic. The part I don't understand oftentimes is that seems to be vacant from the left or the Democrats, you know, but they too take an oath of office. Does it matter anymore? Are we holding true to the oath? But again, it's up to us to hold them accountable and demand that those that we put in office fulfill their promises. And one of those promises is to defend the Constitution. And you know, I've never really been in favor of term limits, but I think until we get things back on track, I don't think it's maybe such a bad idea because people tend to start to take over their position in their elected position and ride the gravy train and feather their own nest and use it as you know, an opportunity to further their own careers instead of serve the American people and to serve liberty.
Well, you know, there's a saying in Washington that everybody knows that Washington, D.C. is a cesspool. And after 2 terms in Congress or in the Senate, they start using it like a hot tub. And boy, howdy, if that isn't the truth. I'm a big believer in term limits, and I know I have a lot of opposition in that regard. But we should not have anyone who is a professional politician.
Amen.
They ought to be statesmen, and they ought to be there to serve the people, and they ought to do it for a very short period of time. And they say, well, the comment I get is, well, if they're going to get anything done, they need to have been there a long time so they know all the ropes and they know how to do it. Guess what? Our system of government was not designed to get a lot of things done. It was designed to protect the system that the founders envisioned, and that didn't mean regulate.
Amen. I totally agree, and we need to get back on track. People need to remember that they're there to serve. Get in, get out, and quite frankly, I think we should be repealing things like crazy. I don't think we should be passing anything right now.
Right, yeah. And get rid of 2 laws for every new law. I think that's a wonderful concept. Mindy, I want, before we run out of time, and whenever we get on one of these calls, we end up running out of time because we really passionately believe in what we believe. I want you to talk about your Missouri bill, HB 1907, and Representative Brian Spencer, and what now has happened. They try to get rid of anybody that stands up against them, and they've been fairly effective at doing that. Talk about Representative Brian Spencer and what's going on down in Missouri.
Representative Spencer is a constitutional conservative serving in the Missouri State House, and he is one of my favorite individuals, not only in Missouri but on the planet. He has so bravely taken on an idea for a bill that has come to fruition, that he made come to fruition, and the working title is the Working Animal Protection Act, that would prohibit an outright ban on any animal industry related to working animals. And just briefly, I'll explain here. HSUS and other animal rights groups have been pushing bans, local bans, on exotic animal exhibits at fairs, educational zoos that attend schools and fairs and other exhibits, elephant rides, pony rides, horse-drawn carriages. They've been passing outright bans of these legal, regulated businesses at the local level. And in the last just handful of years, these bans have happened. There have been 70-plus local municipal bans that have passed at breakneck speed. So people who make their living exhibiting animals or running a carriage horse enterprise, a lot of fairs that have animal exhibits at the fair. And by the way, don't be fooled by the name exotic animals. I mean, a lot of people immediately assume monkeys and tigers and bears and that kind of thing. Well, the animal rights movement makes a point not just to ban those, but also other species of animals that you and I would never consider necessarily exotic. But their intent is to ban animals from being exhibited at all. And without these exhibiting opportunities, many families and many children would never have the opportunity to learn about these species of animals if it weren't for the fair, if it weren't for educational exhibits in this classroom. Many kids in urban settings would never see horses if it weren't for horse-drawn carriages. So we decided, Representative Spencer and I worked together to come up with a piece of legislation that came about as House Bill 1907 and Senate Bill 918, which basically protects any animal-related business that utilizes working animals. And all it says is that no local political subdivision, so city council, county council, cannot come up with legislation to ban outright any legal business that utilizes working animals. This bill has passed through the House Ag Committee, the Senate Ag Committee, the Rules Committee. It's moving along in our State House very nicely, and Representative Spencer has really taken a hit by all the animal rights groups because this is what they do. They're bullies. And so not only have they threatened Spencer's seat in the House of Representatives and our state legislature in Missouri, a local animal rightist in his district has decided to run for office and unseat him. Now, that may sound all fine and well to those who say, well, you know, every seat is up for grabs. The sad part about that is that you know darn well that this individual, this woman, will have the funding of the animal rights groups, which is an endless pit of money. So I would love if your listeners would visit Representative's website, which is citizensforspencer.com, and make a donation of any size to his campaign. He is a true warrior for the Constitution. He is really sincere to his elected position. He is everything that you and I were just saying that elected representatives should be. He is not planning to camp out and stay forever. He's working to do his job to best serve his constituents and exit his post and go on to the next job. But he's true to the Constitution. He really is a warrior, and he has taken on this fight and really has, you know, gone into battle. I don't think he really knew how ugly it would get. But these people have sent him threats, probably death threats, threats of all kinds, trying to coerce him into not allowing this bill to pass. This is about protecting legal businesses. And our these elected representatives or elected, you know, lawmakers at the local level have been playing, you know, basically deciding who gets to stay and who doesn't, and basically picking winners and losers. And that's what we're trying to prevent by allowing these legitimate legal businesses to not be under fire and of the influence of the animal rights industries.
Right. Well, Mindy, we're going to be running out of time here any second. Would you tell our listeners what they can do to support the Cavalry Group and how they can support you? And I remind our listeners, get involved. It's like Debbie Bacigalupi says with her show. You've got to be part of the solution. You cannot continue to sit around and allow everybody else to do the heavy lifting. Mindy, give our listeners a way that they can support you and how they can get more information from you.
Thank you, Dan. Become a member. Go to thecavalrygroup.com, and cavalry is spelled like the military infantry, not the church. It's the Cavalry, CAVALRY, group.com. Click the Join tab and just become an associate member. While we have business memberships for a lot of those running animal-related businesses, you can become an associate member just to support our cause if you aren't interested in the legal aspect of our membership. But we are out there fighting legally, legislatively, and in the PR scope of things to advocate for animal-related businesses and the constitutional right to private property 365 days a year. It feels like 24 hours a day. But it's important, the cornerstone here is that we believe that many generations before us have been called upon to defend liberty when challenged and have answered the call. And this is our time to step forward into the fray to defend freedom and liberty for generations to come. And that's why we formed the Cavalry Group, to step up to the plate, to defend freedom and liberty, and to identify these egregious attacks on American citizens.
Well, again, Mindy, thank you for all you've done and all you are doing. And I remind our listeners, please support this radio network and support the work that we're doing and support the work that Mindy